Hello, and welcome back to Extraordinary Connection. My name's Robert Blanchard, and I'm the pastor here at Lansing First United Methodist Church. I'm happy to have you joining us here today on Extraordinary Connection as I bring you this devotional. Now, today I want to talk with you about one of the saints of the church that serves as an inspiration for my own ministry. Now, I've already talked to you about some of the saints who have a place on the wall behind me, but you won't find the person that I'm talking about today there. Today, I want to talk to you about Father Daniel Berrigan. Friday was the 5th anniversary of his death, and the reason that I want to talk to you about Father Berrigan today is because he embodies what it means for us to live in truth and action as Christians. There is so much to say about Father Berrigan that I hardly have time to scratch the surface of it today. To give you a sense of what I mean, he wrote his autobiography at the age of 66, and it was published in 1987. He had already, by that time, lived a very full life, and then continued to live an equally full and active life until the age of 94 when he passed away in 2016. So what is there to say of Father Berrigan? Well, one could point to the labels that are often applied to him: priest, activist, poet, author. He certainly was all these things and more. Father Berrigan grew up during the Great Depression in a family that was, by his own account, stormy and hard. He was educated briefly in a one-room schoolhouse before being moved to a two-room schoolhouse before finally spending the rest of his primary school days under the stern gaze of nuns at the Catholic school near his home. In these early years, one can already sense in his telling of his life how he chafed at the injustice and petty tyranny of teachers who were, more often than not, inclined to rule through fear and humiliation. After graduating high school, he joined the Jesuits, where one gets a sense of the contradictions that he felt in the high calling of his order and the cloistered, cutthroat nature of their institutions. Is it any wonder that someone with a sharp sense of justice and compassion would come out of these forges bathed in a fire that could not be quenched? The war in Vietnam would prove to be the spark that ignited his flames on the national stage. By the 1960s, Berrigan was already forming friendships with the likes of Dorothy Day of the Catholic Worker Movement, Thomas Merton, the Trappist monk renowned for his writings on spirituality and peace, and A.J. Musty, a Reformed pastor raised here in Grand Rapids who became a titanic figure in the labor and peace movements. Berrigan and his brother Philip, a lifelong co-conspirator, were also among those who formed the Catholic Peace Fellowship to protest American involvement in Vietnam. In 1965, a young man named Roger Laporte, who had been involved with the Catholic Worker Movement, doused himself in gasoline and lit himself on fire in front of the United Nations to protest the war. Before succumbing to his burns at the hospital, Laporte said that the reason he lit himself on fire was that, quote, "I'm a Catholic worker. I'm against war, all wars. I did this as a religious action. All the hatred of the world." End quote. Berrigan was warned by his superiors not to speak about Laporte's death. When he then made remarks to a private gathering of Catholic workers about Laporte giving his life, not out of the kind of desperation that normally drives suicide, but in a more Christ-like manner so that others might live, Berrigan was exiled by his superiors to Latin America. His time among the poor and oppressed of Latin America was short-lived, as he was recalled after only 4 months due to public pressure. Later, he traveled with Howard Zinn to Hanoi in January of 1968, where he saw firsthand the reality of the war on the ground as they received prisoners of war who were being returned to America. Shortly after he returned to America in May of 1968, Berrigan, along with his brother Philip and 7 other Catholics, took 378 draft files from the draft board in Catonsville, Maryland, and burned them in homemade napalm. For this action, Berrigan was sentenced to 3 years in prison, but he went into hiding for several months on the day that his sentence was to begin. He wound up on the FBI's most wanted list, the first priest in American history to do so, and was eventually arrested in the house of noted lay theologian William Stringfellow. In his statement to the court, Berrigan said, "Our apologies, good friends, for the fracture of good order, the burning of paper instead of children." Berrigan's activism would continue to lead him into controversy. He was among the Plowshares 8 who began the Plowshares movement when they trespassed into a GE missile facility in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania, where they hammered the nose cones of unarmed nuclear warheads and poured their own blood out on documents. Late into his life, he was still showing up and getting arrested at protests for peace and economic justice. Less touted is his ministry to those who died during the AIDS epidemic. He practiced a ministry of presence by befriending and accompanying to their deaths many whom the church had declared unclean. With such a storied career, it is easy to venture into hagiography, to lift Father Berrigan up for veneration among his many equally storied friends, and to simply view their accomplishments from afar. But we do a disservice to them and to ourselves when we strip away their humanity by placing them up on a pedestal. I hold Father Berrigan so close to my heart because he reminds me that the saints and I are not so far apart from one another. I cannot think of Dan Berrigan without also thinking of his student and friend, Bill Wiley Kellerman, a retired elder in our Michigan conference who has long been conscientiously agitating alongside the poor and dispossessed of the city of Detroit. Or of the work that Bill has done with clergy friends of mine, whether it be advocating for access to clean drinking water in Detroit, or appearing on their podcasts to talk about theology and the work of justice, or even of the time that he graciously signed a copy of one of his books for me as I awkwardly introduced myself at one annual conference, a bit starstruck to be in the company of someone who's done so much good in the world. I also can't help but think of John Powers, another retired elder from our conference who was the long-serving chaplain at Ohio Wesleyan University. John's path crossed with Father Berrigan's and then later with mine when I completed my field education at the church where John worshiped. John became a mentor and a co-conspirator for me as I raised some good trouble in seminary. And I, in turn, was the Sunday school teacher for John's grandson during my time at their church. And as I think about these connections between Father Berrigan and myself and how those connections branch out beyond us, I'm reminded that the church really is one great family that we enter into. I'm reminded that whether one is a great hierarch, if I can find it, a great hierarch of the church, or an archbishop, or the founder of communities, or an apostle to the nations, or the founder of a great monastic order, or even the Mother of God, or whether one is a troublesome priest who rankled at an injustice. One is also a child, a friend, a loved one, a teacher, a student, and so much more to so many people. Father Berrigan inspires me not just because of the extraordinary circumstances of his life, but because he was an ordinary person, living out his calling as he best knew how. May he inspire all of us to be bold in our witness to the gospel. May we never be silent in the face of injustice. May we never be cold to the need for love. May we aspire to live into the fullness of our humanity through our joyful obedience to God. Amen.